Hey everybody, welcome to NSCC's Wellness Week. My name is Drew Dudley. I want to kick off by thanking the Marconi Students Association for sponsoring this, giving me the chance to come and talk to you today. So about 10 years ago, at the end of 2009, I was wrapping up what I figured was the worst possible year you could imagine, at least until 2020 was like, hold my beer. But I was in such a dark place emotionally within my career that what I decided to do was I needed to take 3 weeks off and get away from what was causing me the most stress, which was other human beings. So I decided to do something I've always wanted to do, which was take the train all the way across Canada, from Vancouver all the way to Halifax. I got a special ticket that let me hop on and hop back off anytime I wanted to. And so ultimately, I hop on this train with a stack of textbooks and articles and stuff that I was supposed to have been reading for ages and never got around to. And I decided, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to spend 3 weeks and I'm not going to talk to anybody. Everybody on this train is a stranger. People aren't going to want to talk to each other. I can just be left in peace and read, never have to interact with another human being. And so I get on the train in Vancouver and I go all the way back to the lounge car right around dinner time, because now everyone's gone to dinner and the car's empty. And I sit down, I open up my book, I start reading, and I'm thinking to myself, all right, 3 weeks, don't have to deal with anybody. And I'm there for maybe 10 minutes, and all of a sudden, busting into this train car is this little girl. She's maybe 7 or 8 years old. And she does 3 laps around the train with her arms out like an airplane, and then just disappears back up the main hallway. I kind of shrug, whatever. She's back like 10 minutes later. She comes in, 3 big laps like an airplane around it, and back up the middle of the train. And this goes on for like 30 minutes. She's back every 10 minutes or so, does the laps, and is gone. And finally, on the last trip, after she does the laps, she sits down directly next to me on the train. And look, there's nobody else in the car, and she decides to sit next to me. Now, at this particular point, I don't have any kids. None of my friends had any kids. And I have to be honest, I have always been uncomfortable talking to kids, not because I don't like them, but because I worked in post-secondary education. So I saw firsthand how screwed up adults can make kids if they say the wrong thing to them when they're young. But this little girl sits next to me and she's sort of swinging her legs off the edge of the chair. And she looks up at me and says, "Hi, I'm Allison." And I kind of look over and say, "Hi, Allison, I'm Drew." And then look right back at the book, which is the international social signal for I don't want to talk to anybody right now. The problem is that 7-year-olds don't necessarily know that signal or don't necessarily care about that signal. So she just keeps going. "What are you reading?" And I said, "Oh, I'm just reading a book for work." And her eyes get really big and she looks at me and says, "You get to read books for work? My dad has to go to an office." And there was something about that that just made me like this girl. And so she says, "All right, well, what's the story?" And I look down at this textbook that I'm reading and I'm like, well, this book doesn't really have a story. "Well, don't all books have stories?" And I said, "Well, no, I guess some just have knowledge." And she says, "Well, aren't stories knowledge?" And see, this is what I was afraid of, because I don't want this little girl going out into the world and thinking that stories aren't knowledge. So I close the book because I want her to know it's important. And I look at her and I say, "No, Allison, actually, a very smart man I know once told me that the story is the basic unit of human understanding." And as soon as it came out of my mouth, all I could think of was, dude, she's 7. Maybe the story is the basic unit of human understanding is a little much for a 7-year-old. But see, we don't get to decide what kids understand. Kids get to decide what they understand. And she just looks very sort of thoughtful for a second and goes, "I think your friend is very smart." And I can't believe how smart and articulate this girl is. And so I say to her, "Well, Allison, can I ask you a question?" And she says, "It's only fair." And I said, "Why are you running up and down the train? I've been watching you for half an hour. You just keep going up and down. Why?" She goes, "Oh, my parents were afraid this would happen. You see, my parents say that I have a very big spirit. They say that my spirit is almost always too big for every room that I'm in. And if you think about it, a train is just like a big, long hallway. And if my spirit is too big for all the rooms I'm in, it's definitely too big for hallways. But anytime I'm stuck somewhere that isn't big enough for my spirit, I run. I run to remind myself that I'm always free if I want to be." And there's something about the way she said it with such honesty and not any pretension whatsoever, because kids have an ability to drop wisdom on you, and they do it without trying to sound cool or smart. And there was something about her saying that made me realize that, man, it had been so long since I actually felt like I was free anywhere. Everywhere I went, in my personal life, in my work, I always felt trapped. And I had done nothing about it except wallow in it. And here was this little 7-year-old girl just basically saying, I just decide to be free when I want to be. And it had this really powerful impact on me. And I said to her, Allison, I'm so glad you told me that, because I've been really sad for a long time. And I think that maybe you just helped me figure it out, because I think maybe the problem is that I'm spending too much time in places and around people that aren't big enough for my spirit. So thanks. And she hops off the chair and she kind of stares at me for a minute and says, Drew, I don't mean to be rude, but I don't know if anyone whose spirit is too big for their room would ever read a book without a good story. Bye. And she's gone. Because kids decide when the conversation's over. And I'm sitting there alone in this train car. And it hit me really profoundly at that moment that I was someone who thought of himself as a person who went out and collected other people's stories, who shared other people's stories, who shared pieces of my story. And yet what I was actually doing was so much different than how I perceived myself, because I was about to spend 3 weeks on a train, and my entire goal was to collect nobody's stories, not tell anyone mine, in fact, to stay as quiet as I possibly could. And look, I don't know the secret to happiness, but I do know that one of the core pieces of unhappiness is when a gap starts to form between the person you want to be and how you are actually behaving, and you become aware of that gap. But I think that gap exists for all of us. I think most of us don't deny it. Because it exists for all of us, there's no reason to be ashamed of it. But I think that what happens is most of us don't deny it's there. But I think we mostly rationalize that gap as being temporary. Yeah, there's a gap between the person I want to be and how I'm actually behaving, but just until the pandemic's over, just until I graduate, just until I get the promotion, or the baby comes, or the mortgage is paid off, or I retire, whatever it is, we will always come up with a reason to rationalize that gap between the person we want to be and how we are actually behaving. And my work in leadership says that I believe at its fundamental level, leadership is acknowledging that that gap exists in our lives between the person we want to be and how we're behaving, recognizing that that gap is our responsibility, and coming up with a plan every day to try to close that gap just a little bit. And shortly after I came back from that train trip, I worked with a group of students at the University of Toronto because I ran their leadership program for about 10 years. And what we decided to do was see, is it possible to actually make our behaviors every day align with the person we claimed to be? Because one thing I found in my work is that the phrase, I'm the type of person who, it's almost always followed by a lie. Like stuff that's true about you and your character, you don't announce it, you demonstrate it. And so we were trying to figure out, is there a way that we can actually live up to the things that we claim to stand for? And the experiment started when we said, okay, let's pick one particular value that we want to embody every single day without question. And we actually settled on impact. My students picked this one out. And we said, okay, you can't actually live up to something if you don't define what it means. And so we said, okay, impact is a commitment to creating moments that cause people to feel as if they are better off for having interacted with you. And that became our mission, is every single day we were supposed to go out there and create one moment like that. And I told my students, your job was to come to my office every day before you go home, look me in the eye and tell me how you did it. The problem was, what happened is that the students would come to my outer office and they'd stop for a minute and they'd do some version of like, and I realized that what they were doing, what I was doing, is they were looking back over the course of their day and they were trying to identify a moment where they had actually done this. And because they were awesome people, they almost always had one. But the problem is what they were doing is they were taking this value that they said they wanted to define them as a person, and they were using it to evaluate behavior that had already happened. See, what leaders do is they use their values to drive behavior, to impact decision-making in the moment. And if you aren't thinking about your value until the very end of the day and trying to remember where you put it in there, Ultimately, it means it's not front of your mind when you're actually making decisions. And so we needed a different approach. And so the beautiful thing about working at a university is that somewhere on the campus, there is an expert on everything. And it's particularly fun to go and ask the psych department for advice because these guys know how to play with people's minds. And so I went to the psych department and I said, hey, can you teach me how to control the behavior of 20-year-olds? And they laughed their ass off. And I said, okay, here's what I actually mean. We want to behave a certain way. We want to have this impact, and we defined it like this. But life's getting in the way, and school's getting in the way, and work is getting in the way. We're not thinking about it. Do you have any subconscious psychological tricks, any behavioral psychology insights that we could take them, and if we couple these subconscious motivators with our conscious desire to do something, we're way more likely to do it. Do you have anything like that? And they said, yeah. And they gave me 2 behavioral psychology effects that we put to use. And the first is called the Zeigarnik effect, which is an example of PhDs taking something relatively simple and making it sound complex. And the Zeigarnik effect just basically says this: things on your to-do list that you have not yet completed take up a more prominent spot in your consciousness than things that you have completed. In other words, stuff you haven't done bugs you until you've finished it. See, we all know that, but what I didn't understand was the depth of how uncomfortable your brain got when it didn't finish a task. And the other one they taught me was called the question behavior effect. And the question behavior effect basically says that asking someone a series of questions about a particular behavior is actually way more likely to get them to engage in that behavior later in the day than if you'd asked them to do it or if you told them to do it. So if I sat down with any one of you over breakfast and said, okay, what does generosity mean to you? Who's the most generous person you've ever met? What's the single most generous act you've ever witnessed? Later on in the day, you are way more likely to seek out, seize, or create an opportunity to be generous than if I had simply told you you had to do it or asked you incredibly nicely to do it. And so it basically came down to this. If questions are a powerful driver of human behavior, and unfinished tasks cause psychic discomfort until they're finished, what we're going to do to try to better control and push our behavior towards the behaviors and the values we care about is we're going to harness the power of the unanswered question. Like the human brain hates unanswered questions, can't stand them. If a question gets put into your brain, yeah, it works on it consciously, but then when you think you forget about it or you move on, all it's actually done is shoved it to your subconscious, and it keeps working away at that question until it finds an answer. And if it can't find an answer, what it does is it makes one up and convinces you that it's true, which is an incredibly dangerous phenomenon. I think the most practical example with which most of us can relate is at some point in your life, you've been trying to remember the name of an actor or an actress, and you can't, and just out of pride, you say, I'm not going to Google it, and then you think you forget about it. But sometime in the next 24 hours, 48 hours, you're in the shower, you're walking down the street, you're driving your car, all of a sudden the name of that actor or actress pops into your head. That's the Zeigarnik effect. That's the question behavior effect. Your brain cannot stand an unanswered question. So we said, okay, we're going to take a different approach to trying to live an important value in our life. What we're going to do is we're going to create a question, one that's carefully crafted so that in order to answer it, you have to do something. And if you do that something, you will have lived the value. And that's the one we came up with right there. What have I done today to recognize someone else's leadership? The general idea being that it's pretty much impossible to tell someone how they're a leader in your life and not have them walk away feeling better off for it. It's impossible to say to someone, the way you do your job, the way that you've treated me, the way you treat other people, the opportunities you've given me have made me a better person, made my life better, and you're a leader to me. Like nobody hears that and is like, dick. Everybody walks away from that feeling better. And the beautiful thing about that question is it's not a yes-no question. You can lie to yourself on a yes-no question. Hey, did I recognize someone's leadership today? Yeah, sure, whatever. But how did I or what did I do today means you got to give the who, what, where, why, when, and how. You got to be specific. And the other thing that was important to us is that this question could be answered a bunch of different ways, which means It's as accessible to the introverts we were working with as to the extroverts. Because so many leadership ideas, so many leadership insights are focused on people who like to be the center of attention, who are extroverts. And for introverts out there, I think the idea that leadership is a part of who you are, as a result of that, there's a separation between a lot of introverts and the idea that they have every right to call themselves leaders. And so the mission became, go out and answer that question every day. And I said, you know what? Do it for a week. And what we'll do is a week from now, we'll get back together. We have a 90-minute workshop and we'll compare the two experiences. When we went out there trying to remember to have impact versus when we went out there with this question on our minds, on our phones, popping up to remind us every 3 hours that we have to answer this question. Which was more effective? And ultimately, that question made me quit my job because my students destroyed this assignment. Their former teachers, their former coaches, their best friends, their parents, the incredibly nice hot dog guy on campus, because everybody loved this guy. And the thing was, on the Thursday of this assignment, I went out to buy a hot dog and he pulled it back and he goes, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm buying a hot dog." He said, "No, 3 different students have called me a leader this week. What are you doing?" Because what happened is my students went out and in order to answer this question, they stopped looking for the people who told them what to do, which is how we traditionally think of leaders. And instead, they started looking for the people who changed the way they felt on a given day. And that could be the guy who served them hot dogs or the person at Tim Hortons or the bus driver that took them to school. Whatever it was, they started looking for leadership in behaviors that made them feel better. And when we came back together a week later, that 1.5-hour workshop turned into 4.5 hours. Because everybody had these incredible, powerful moments of interaction where they let people know the kind of impact they'd had on them. That question changes people because leadership recognized is leadership created. And if we want to do a better job creating leadership in our lives, in our communities, on our campuses, what we need to do is start to recognize the leadership that surrounds us every day, the individuals who create these powerful moments of interpersonal impact. It was such a powerful set of experiences that at the end of 30 days answering that question, my students did something I haven't seen before or since. They asked for another test. And they said, let's pick another value. So we picked a second value and we defined it. And then we created a question that was attached to that value. And we tried to answer one of those 2 questions every day. In month 3, we added another, then 4. By the end of the school year, we had what we called the leadership test. And the leadership test was a series of 6 questions, each one of them specifically designed to drive a type of behavior that lived up to a certain value. We said that we want to be people who embody impact, growth, courage, empowerment, class, and self-respect. And what we did is we created one of those action-driving questions, the kind that demanded specificity, that you couldn't answer without living the value. We created one for every single one of those values. What did I do today to recognize someone else's leadership? What did I do today to make it more likely someone would learn something? What did I try today that might not work, but I tried anyway? What did I do today to move someone else closer to a goal? When did I elevate instead of escalate? And what we meant by that is when we were faced with a situation where it was easy to get angry, did we focus on succeeding, which is elevating, versus winning, which is often escalating? And that final one right there, self-respect. What did I do today to be good to myself? Now, my work in general is helping people and companies figure out what their core values are, defining them, and then creating their own customized leadership test. But for today's presentation, given that it's Wellness Week, there's one particular of those values that I want to focus on in one of the questions, and that is self-respect. A commitment to recognizing that when you are empty, you have nothing to give. And somewhere along the way, I think we made leadership about emptying ourselves out. It's about how much of yourself that you give. But once you're empty, as a matter of fact, not only can you not give to anyone else, not to your kids, not to your friends, not to your family, not to your fellow students, you actually start to pull energy from them. So self-respect ultimately is recognizing that when we are empty, we have nothing to give. And we all nod our heads and we say, yeah, I know that. But one of the things that really struck me, because I was one of the people who knew that, and yet I didn't realize to what degree I was ignoring it until I was at this conference. And it was a tech conference, had nothing to do with leadership. And one of the presenters put some version of this up on the screen, like just a dead phone battery. And immediately I felt incredibly uncomfortable. Some of you may have actually reached for your phone when I did it, because that's what I did that day. I reached for my phone. And what caught my eye is that everybody else in the row did it as well. Just looking at that image sometimes causes us to like stress out. But if that image actually shows up in the top right-hand corner of your phone, our entire existence becomes about it. I've seen men in $5,000 bespoke suits sit on the floor of airports in order to charge their phone. And yet every single one of us has gone to work, gone to school at less than 10% emotionally, physically, spiritually, and intellectually. Every single one of us has done it. Why is it that if we allow our phone to drop below 10%, we're professionally irresponsible? But if we ourselves drop below 10%, we're somehow dedicated to our job and dedicated to our work. If you want to actually have like a simple test about whether or not you're treating yourself with the self-respect that you should, I guess one of the easiest questions is, am I treating myself with the same amount of respect that I treat my phone? Because you charge that thing all the time, and we wrap it in protective glass and protective cases because you know that it's going to hit the ground. And so you protect it ahead of time, and when it hits the ground, you pick it up and you don't start to question whether or not you have some flaw in your character or that you're weak. But when we actually hit the ground, we tend to immediately start to ask ourselves, what is wrong with me? Why am I so weak? Why could I not avoid that? Do you treat yourself with the same amount of respect that you treat your phone? And what I want to do with the rest of the time that I have today is dive into that self-respect question. What have I done today to be good to myself? Specifically, what I want to share with you are 5 strategies that were taught to me by wildly different leaders. And a huge part of my work is recognizing that we were taught to look for leadership from people who look and who sound a certain way. And in fact, most of the leadership on this planet comes from people who don't think that they're leaders. And what I want to do is take 5 of them, very different, and share with you 5 of the insights they've given me to help me understand how to answer the question, what have I done today to be good to myself, a little bit more effectively. So let's start with this particular one, recognizing that happiness has to be cultivated. I had a friend of mine who had battled addiction for most of her life. And when she was in rehab, I went to visit her. We went out on the grounds and we started to walk around. And I think most of us have experienced a day where we are so just pissed at the world. And for whatever reason, we want to get more angry. Like people will offer us suggestions, they'll try to cheer us up, and we actually almost revel in starting to spiral downward and getting angrier and angrier. And I'm out walking with her, and I'm doing that to her. And all of a sudden I start to realize I'm with her at rehab, and it's all about me, and it's all about my complaining. And I stopped and I apologized. And she says, look, man, I get how you feel. Like I have a lot of bad days. And I cannot do anything to fix you today, and I'm not going to try. But I do want to tell you that my good days are so rare that when they happen, not only do I try to honor them, but I also recognize that maybe I can take some of what I have today and use it for one of my future bad days. So man, I can't help you, Drew. But here's what I want you to do. The next time you have a good day, think about how you felt today and do something on that good day that will still be around to make you smile on the next crappy one. She goes, because happiness has to be cultivated. And on the good days, don't just enjoy the happiness you've got. Plant some of it so that you can harvest it later. And we finished the rest of the day. We walked in. And a couple of days later, I had gone to a speech. It was in an awesome hotel. The crowd was amazing. The speech went really well. And I go back to my room and I look over at my computer screen and I'm like, you know what? I'm having an awesome day. And I want to do something that's going to make me happy someday in the future. I'm going to take her advice. And at that particular time in my life, my PowerPoint presentation was incredibly boring. It just looked like this because I'm like, you know what? No matter what the lighting in the room is, you can see it. And so what I decided to do is, you know what? I'm going to add photographs to my presentation. Like every photograph you're going to see randomly in the rest of this presentation, they don't seem to make any sense, but they're not stock photographs. Every photo that you're going to see in this presentation, I took it. Everyone represents a moment of peace and joy and awe and happiness in my life. And what I did is I actually put it into my presentations because there's not much in my life that's consistent. Usually before the pandemic, I was on the road 250 days a year. But there's almost always a video or PowerPoint presentation around me. And I said, every single day, it's going to be impossible for me to do my job without being reminded that my life is amazing, even on the worst ones. And guess what? That's a moment that I created for myself every single day. Because if you rely on other people for your happiness, you're always going to feel like you don't get enough of it. So look, if you love a certain kind of candy, stick it in a coffee cup in the coffee holder of your car, because there will be a day where you go out there and you sit down in your car and you grab the steering wheel and you're imagining it's another human being. And then you're going to look down and you're going to be like, candy, way to go past me. One of the things that I've started to do during the pandemic is I went all the way back to the first photographs in my phone. And I started to put them into a special folder. I just scrolled through them. And every now and then as you scroll through these, for me it was 18,000 photos, you see one that just hits you emotionally. It reminds you of something amazing. And I just put it into a special folder. And then anytime I'm feeling crappy, what I do is I open up that folder and I look at the photos. And anytime there's another person in the photo, I just randomly text them the photo. Because life starts to get in the way. We have kids, we get jobs, we change careers. And people that we love, it's not like we fall out with them. It's just that life starts to happen. But every now and then, I just like to look back at this picture of us in Hawaii or that picture of that amazing night out, and I just send it to the people in it or the person in it. And I'm like, I was just thinking of you. And that's an amazing moment. But on the good days, I go through the photos and put them in the folder. If you drive to school, you drive to work, and you don't have the photograph of someone you love hanging from your rearview mirror on your dashboard, you're missing an opportunity to smile once a day. And I've given that piece of advice for ages. And then one of the first times I ever gave this particular keynote, I got into an Uber to drive to the venue. And sure enough, the woman in the car, my Uber driver, had these photos of her daughter up on the dashboard. And I said, oh my God, I tell people to do that. I tell them that if you do something like that, you guarantee yourself one moment of happiness every day at least. And she kind of looks sideways over her shoulder and goes, yeah, you don't have kids, do you? And I said, no, what do you mean? She goes, I got to be honest. Look, sometimes the people you love, you don't like them very much. But that doesn't always bring me happiness. But every time I look at her, it reminds me that I'm connected to something bigger in this world. And sometimes that's more important than happiness, to be reminded that you're connected to something bigger. Put the photographs of people you care about in places that you cannot miss them. Yeah, they're in our phone. And yeah, sometimes we stick them on our desk, but put them into a place where you cannot miss them. And real photographs as well. There's something different about pulling them off your phone and sticking them somewhere. And yeah, sometimes the people we love, we don't like them very much. So I double-side my photographs. On one side, my family. On the other, Jennifer Lawrence. Every day I'm guaranteed to have at least one particularly good moment where I'm connected to something bigger in this world. Happiness has to be cultivated. On your good days, plant something for the pissed off version of yourself you know is coming down the pipe. Next up, we got a plan for failure. And I'm not here to talk about, oh, you know, it's not failure if you learn something from it. Yeah, no, that's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about planning for it. So I guess about 7 years ago, I went down to give a speech in Orlando. And when we were kids, I never got to go to Disney World, and I'm still pissed about it, because we had a cottage. And when you're a kid, a cottage means like you got no video games and you got no TV and none of your friends. But once you get old enough to hit high school and have beer, cottages are awesome. But at the time, I was always pissed about it. So 7 years ago, I go down to give a speech in Orlando. I'm done at like 10:30 in the morning. And I just randomly decide, basically dressed like this, that I'm going to go to Universal Studios. And I go to Universal Studios, start wandering around, and I decide that I want to go on this roller coaster that rolls through the Hogwarts castle. It's the best ride in the world, by the way, but it's like 2.5 hours to wait to get on this line. We start to weave through the castle, and as I start to get to the front of the line, I notice that the kid, he's maybe like 18 or 19 years old, who's running the turnstile, is starting to look a little uncomfortable. And I get to the front of the line and I go through the turnstile, and he kind of takes me by the elbow. Instead of taking me to the roller coaster, he pulls me off to the side and he says, "I'm so sorry, sir, but I'm afraid that our ride cannot safely accommodate your dimensions." because at the time I was well over 320 pounds. And they have these chairs outside the ride where you can test if you fit, and I did not see them. And so I waited 2.5 hours to have this poor kid have to tell me, I'm sorry, sir, you can't get on the ride. And he showed me down the back steps, and I had to wind down the back steps and back out into the park. And it was devastating. And then when I tried to fly home for the first time in my life, the seatbelt wouldn't do up. And it was one of those like eye-opening moments. And I got home and I said, something has to change. And so I called up one of my friends, like the fitness friend. We all have one of these people. They have multiple running shoes for different conditions. And I said, look, I got to lose 100 pounds and I don't know how to do it. Help me. And she came over and we talked for a long time. And then she came back a couple of days later after thinking about it all. And she said, look, we're going to approach this the same way you approach this like leadership stuff. All right. We're going to do it with questions. And so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you 3 questions. And if you can find a way to answer these questions every day, we're going to find a way to help you lose 100 pounds. And the questions were very specific to me, so they won't work for everybody. But she was like, question 1, have I eaten less than 1,800 calories today? 2, have I burned over 3,000 calories in total? Not just in exercise, but just in total. And she got me a Fitbit to help me with that. And 3, have I done 15 more seconds of cardio than I did yesterday? And I thought that was, and she goes, start with 60 seconds. And I was like, that's insulting. Who can't do 60 seconds of cardio? This dude couldn't do 60 seconds of cardio. But it's the next thing she said. She said, look, it's not failure that blows up missions like this. It's unplanned for failure. So we're going to plan failure into this. Here's the deal. If you answer those questions 300 out of the next 365 days, we're going to give you 65 days, more than 2 months, where you're on the road and the banquet you're speaking at has no healthy food, where your friend invites you over for dinner and you don't want to be rude and not eat what they made. If you're just on the road and lonely and you want some pizza to feel better, you get 65 days to do that. And every time you do it, you are in no way, shape, or form violating what we're trying to do because you're allowed to do it. It's built in. But you answer those 3 questions 300 out of the next 365 days, you will be 100 pounds lighter a year from today. And I was 100.7 pounds lighter a year to that day. It's not failure that destroys us. It's unplanned for failure. And I'll tell you, if you have any plan in your life, whether it's academic, whether it's business, whether it's financial, whether it's romantic, whatever it is, if you can't point to 2 or 3 places where you say, I'm going to fail here. I know it's coming and I'm ready for it. I'm going to show you a plan that isn't going to work. The challenge is that failure is made into something that we absolutely fear through most of our lives. There are so many untaught lessons in the education system, things that are learned even though they're never explicitly taught. And let's honestly face it, like we all go through an education system that basically teaches us, all right, you begin everything at 100%. Every assignment, every class, and every mistake you make, you lose points. And you never get the points back. And that's a terrible way of looking at the world, because what it does is it makes so many of us less concerned about how smart we are, how wise we are, how resilient we are, how powerful we are right now, and it puts all of our focus on how few mistakes we made along the way. So we have got to find a way to become more comfortable with failure. And one of the tools that I was taught, really quite unexpectedly, is this tool called rejection therapy. And this was created by a Canadian, but it's a guy by the name of Jia Zhang who really popularized it. He did a TED Talk on it. He wrote a book called Rejection Proof. I highly recommend it. But I learned it from a couple of like 27-year-old tech multimillionaires at a conference. And we were sitting around late one night and they were telling me this story and they mentioned this rejection therapy thing. And I said, well, what is that? And they said, look, we've never been cool. Like we know we're not cool. But when you're not cool, you're always afraid of rejection. You're afraid of rejection from the cool kids. We were afraid of rejection from girls. But what we found, man, is that if you're afraid of having your ideas rejected, you're never going to offer them. And ideas that you don't offer aren't even ideas. They're just daydreams. And if you're bad at something and you don't want to be bad at it anymore, you have to practice. Which is such a simple life truth, but I never heard it put quite so simply. If you suck and you no longer wish to suck, practice. And they said, so we needed to practice rejection, so we did rejection therapy. And what it basically means is that the 2 of us pick one day a month, and we compete to see who can be rejected more times in a 24-hour period. And whoever gets rejected fewer times has to buy dinner for the other person every day for a month. And they're loaded, so this was more of a pride thing. And I said, well, what happens on those days? And he goes, man, look, I never had a date for pretty much all of high school and university. And now every single Saturday night, I go out with someone amazing because one day a month I walk up to the most fascinating people I can find and I just say, hey, will you have dinner with me? And he says, the answer is almost always the same. They always look at me and say, I don't even know you. How that's different than Tinder, I don't know. And he says, I always just tell them, I know, but one day a month I try to be rejected as many times as I can. It makes me a better man. And he said, apparently that's really interesting. And being interesting is more important than being hot, which I wish somebody had told me on the first day of high school. He says we walk into Subway and we're just like, hey, can we make our own sandwich? He's like, you have no idea how many sandwich artists are not paid enough to care. They're just like, here's a hairnet and gloves, go to town. He's like, we walk up to cops and we're like, hey, can we shoot at stop signs like in that movie Superbad? And he says 3 really important things we've learned from doing this for over a year. 1, you're not rejected nearly as often as you think you're going to be. In fact, sometimes you have to work really hard at it. 2, when you are rejected and you expect it, it has absolutely no impact on your self-worth. In fact, because you had to work at it, it sometimes feels more like an accomplishment. And eventually that feeling just spills over into every other day of the year. And 3, they said, even when you are rejected, you are almost always offered something better than what you currently have. He said, look, no cop has ever allowed us to shoot anything, touch their gun. But 2 of them have just let us drive their squad cars around. And it was this idea of rejection therapy that gave birth to that courage question from earlier on. What have I done today that might not work, but I tried it anyway? Jha talks about in his book and his TED Talk that if you want to try this out, you don't have to take these big risks that put careers or lives on the line, but like walk up the next time you're in a restaurant that says free refills, just go up and ask for a burger refill and watch what happens. What did I try today that might not work, but tried anyway, has led to some of the coolest moments in my life. I've gotten to ride a private jet. All I did was stand at the private terminal in Toronto, and as people walk by, just ask them, hey, can I ride your plane? It took 8 people before somebody let me on their private jet. I got to drive a Formula 2000 race car, or I would have until I asked what the third pedal was for. Guy yanked me out of his $1 million race car. Eat at the chef's tables of Michelin star restaurants. Make the announcements on planes. I met the love of my life because of that question. Because I took one look at her and I said, I don't think this is going to work, but I'm going to try it anyway. Failure, hey, and guess what? Failure will follow you around your entire life. I am pretty good at this, but the first time I put this brand new presentation together with the new graphics, I actually presented with that up on the screen. And if you're like me and you simply did not notice it, I spelled failure wrong. The irony was not lost on me. But I actually put all this together, was preparing to do this whole spiel, and sure enough, the first time I ever presented, I misspelled the word failure. It'll follow you around your entire life. Get used to it. Realize that by actually putting it in your life intentionally, by planning for it, it stops having the same sort of impact on you. All right, the next one. My friend, Stephanie Dixon, is a force of nature. Stephanie has represented Canada at the Sydney, Athens, and Beijing Games. She has 19 medals, 7 of them gold, 6 world records, 10 world championships. She's a member of the Canadian Sports Hall of Fame, and she was given the Order of Canada by the time she was 35 years old. And she has 1 leg. Stephanie is Canada's most decorated Paralympian. She's been the chef de mission for almost every Paralympic Games since she retired as an athlete at like 32. And she blows me away. And the thing is, when you hang out with people who are this accomplished, you end up always sort of, I don't know, questioning yourself, like wondering, like, why am I not this amazing? And we shouldn't do it, but we do inevitably compare ourselves to other people. And I was out one night, I was having dinner with Steph, and all these insecurities sort of bubbled up. And I started to talk to her about all of these criticisms I heard other people talking to me about. I, in 2007, had an extraordinarily difficult year to the point where I almost hurt myself. And I promised when I came through that I was never going to work 80, 90 hours a week again and destroy myself. I actually now, and I recognize that this is a privileged thing to say, but I actually now have adopted a philosophy that if I work more than 40 hours a week, I have failed myself. And you do lose things because of that. You lose opportunities and you lose money. But I've never been lost since I started taking that approach. But I started to talk to Steph about, people say I should have my book written. My company should have grown a lot more. I should be expanding. And I just started rolling on about all these things people had said about my life. And Steph cuts me off and she goes, "Do you like your job?" I was like, "I love my job." She goes, "Do you like your life?" I said, "I absolutely love my life." She said, "Okay, you need to stop wearing your fake leg." And I was utterly confused. And so she told me this. She says, "Look, almost every prosthetic in the world is built to go onto or fit over at least some portion of a limb. The thing was, I was born completely without a right hip. There is absolutely no part of a leg there. And that means that almost every prosthetic I had growing up slowed me down and hurt me a great deal. I am so much faster on just a set of crutches and one leg. But for almost all of high school and university, I always wore a fake leg and it hurt so much and it slowed me down. But what it did is it made other people more comfortable when I walked in the room because I watched how awkward people looked when the one-legged girl walked into the room." And she said, "But I'll tell you something though. Anything that you keep in your life that slows you down and hurts you, and the only reason you keep it in your life is because it makes other people more okay with who you are and the decisions that you made, that is a fake leg. And honestly, I see more able-bodied people wearing fake legs than I do at the Paralympics." She said, "Drew, what you've got to do is stop wearing a fake leg because all you're doing is using other people's opinions of your life to slow you down and hurt you." And that hit me in a profound way. It also reminded me, years ago, I used to be a music producer. And I still remember this young woman coming in and performing a song, and the lyrics like burned themselves into my brain. And she wrote, "There's a difference between grounded and run into the ground. And some things keep you rooted and some just weigh you down. And you have to decide what you'd rather keep around." One of the most courageous things and one of the most powerful acts of self-respect is to take a look at all the relationships in your life. And this isn't just with people. This is with jobs. This is with schools. This is with cities and places where you live. Is taking a look at every relationship in your life and honestly asking yourself, which one of these are keeping me grounded, are giving me a foundation, are giving me strength, and which of these are weighing me down? They're only still in my life because it makes other people more okay with who I am, or I'm afraid of being judged. Like, we all know people who are in relationships that are abusive, that they shouldn't be in, that long ago stopped being something that added value to their life, but you don't want to be a divorcee in your 30s or your 40s or your 50s. We have people who are in jobs that are slowly destroying them, but they don't want to say, "Oh my God, that person left a really good paying job with great benefits. What are they, an idiot?" One of the hardest things to do, but one of the things that shows such a tremendous level of self-respect, is having the courage to take a look at your life and ask yourself, where in my life am I settling? Am I settling in my relationships? Am I settling in my job? Am I settling in my health? Because I don't care how old any of you are. You're too young to settle. Remember that. Life's going to throw enough crap at you from the front for us to be dragging along anchors behind. If it's in your life and it hurts you and slows you down, it doesn't belong there anymore. And self-respect ultimately is having the courage to keep making changes in your life until it's the life you want and the life you deserve. And you all have the opportunity and the right to do that. And in some ways, I think we have the obligation to do it as well. All right, tip number 4. Recognize that greatest is the enemy of great. At the end of that train trip, after Allison gave me that little speech, everything changed for me on the trip. I started reaching out to everyone I sat next to, asking them for their story, their insights on leadership, all the things that they would pass on to their kids if they had one piece of advice to give. And I learned so much and I made so many friends. And then in Montreal, because there's actually no train that goes across Canada anymore. One goes from Vancouver to Montreal, and then the one goes from Montreal out to Halifax. And when we got on in Montreal, I was in the bar car and 2 guys got on the train. And I've never met 2 people more dedicated to having a good time than these guys. They bust in, they're originally from Newfoundland, so they bust in and they go around the entire car, shake hands with everybody, introduce themselves, buy everybody in the car a drink. They scream, does anybody have a guitar? They make some dude go back to his seat, bring his guitar so they can do this big, East Coast sing-along. And they were right off the wall, and they were 89 and 91 years old. Jimmy and Earl. And these guys impacted me so much that I was like, you know what, guys? I went up to Earl. Any chance that I could have my last meal on the train with you? Last meal is breakfast before we pull into Halifax tomorrow. Are you okay? Could we have breakfast together? I just want to pick your brain. And Earl's like, yeah, no problem, man. Just you got to do one thing for me. And I assumed that, he wanted me to bring him booze. He said, what I want you to do is go home back to your little room tonight. And I want you to write down the 5 things that you would do if you knew you were going to die at the end of the day tomorrow. And I remember thinking, that is dark. Why? And he laughed and he goes, well, man, at our age, it might happen. We just want to see if anybody's got any good ideas. And so I went back and I did it. I sat down, I wrote down the 5 things I'd do if I was going to die at the end of the day tomorrow. And then I get up the next day, I go to breakfast and we sit down, the small talk starts. And they're like, what do you do? And I said, well, I run the leadership development program at the University of Toronto. And Earl goes, oh, so you're an educator? And I said, yeah. He goes, all right. What is one thing that you want to make sure every single student who ever goes through your courses knows for sure? And I never really thought about that. But I said, okay, I want them to realize that they're focusing on all the wrong things. Because here's the deal. On the first day, I always ask a series of questions. I'm like, okay, how many of you in this room know what your GPA was last semester? And all the hands go up. And I said, okay, how many of you in this room can tell me how much money you get paid at your job, whether annually or per hour? And all the hands go up. Like, how many of you can tell me who sings Party in the USA? And all the hands go up. And I say, but then I always ask them, all right, how many of you can tell me the single happiest moment of your life? And none of the hands go up. And I said, money, Marks, and Miley, everyone's got them like that. But you ask for the happiest moment of your life and you can't think of it? That says that we all got our priorities all screwed up. And I kind of sit back because I've told that to tons of people and they always give me about the same response, which is like, way to go, man. Like, way to challenge those students, way to call them out. And Earl leans forward and goes, that is because it's a dumbass question. I'm not used to getting called out like that. And I said, what do you mean it's dumb? Like, you don't think that it's a good idea to make young people realize that they don't even know what the happiest moment of their life is? And Earl goes, I think it's way more important for you to recognize as an educator how dangerous that question is. Because all you're doing is reinforcing this social tendency to only focus on the best things in the world. Like, look, man, you get one happiest moment of your life. You get one most delicious meal, one most beautiful sunset, one most spectacular kiss. You get one of each. But numbers 2 through 50 are also pretty great. The problem is if all we ever do is look at the very best and everything else gets diminished when compared to it, we're ignoring some of the greatest stuff in our life because they're not the greatest. He said, Drew, greatest is the enemy of great. And I think you're far better off not being part of this society that tells people whatever happens in your life, compare it to the absolute best thing that ever did. You got to stop doing that. And I loved it. But I was like, okay, man, but if I'm not going to do that, I have to tell them something else. So what should I tell them to do? And Jimmy goes, okay, look, I want you to draw a line in your mind. And it's just called the great line. And anytime you have a great experience, a sunset, a meal, a kiss, a happy moment, all you ask yourself is one question. Was that above the great line? Because right now, what we basically do is we teach it like one of those old CD towers, right? Where you just decide where does it slot in. That was number 4. That was number 6. He's like, instead of treating it like a ranking, all you do when you ask, is it above the great line? If the answer is yes, it's like throwing it into an attic. It doesn't matter where it lands, and it doesn't end up ranked above or below anything else. And you can wander into that attic anytime you want. Pick anything up, and it brings you happiness. But every time we rank things compared to every other experience in our life, we diminish everything but the greatest. And then Earl was like, yeah, if you think of it like poker, imagine you get one chip for the greatest everything, sunset, meal, kiss, sex, whatever. There's a limited number of chips you get. You get one for every category. But if you draw the great line and you give yourself a chip for anything that goes above it, then you have an unlimited amount of resources and riches that you can earn in your life. He said, tell people, only worry about the great line. Greatest is the enemy of great. And it's so changed the way I look at gratitude in my life, because I think we all do that. We always compare whatever meal we have to the best one that we ever had. And that inevitably diminishes most of the best experiences in our lives. And I never forgot it, but I wanted to know where it came from, because that's such an interesting philosophy. And I said, okay, well, where did you come up with that? And Earl goes, well, when you have the happiest moment of your life when you're 16 years old, you kind of have to adopt that philosophy, or your whole life is downhill from there. And I said, you had the greatest moment of your life when you were 16 years old? He says, I thought I did. I was wrong. But when I hit the end of the beach, I thought it was the happiest moment I'd ever have. And I said, beach? What beach? And he says, Juno Beach. And of course, Juno Beach is the beach that most of the Canadian forces landed on D-Day in Normandy. And I looked at these two guys. I'm like, you guys were at D-Day? And they're like, we met at D-Day. And then they kick into one of those stories that two friends have told so many times that they have their own like parts and they know exactly when to cut each other off. It's basically like a rehearsed performance. And they start telling me the story. And Earl's like, I'm crawling along on the beach and I look up, and up in the distance, maybe 30 yards ahead, is this guy. He points at Jimmy, and he's trying to yank something out of the beach, but he's standing there and there's these bullets flying and bombs everywhere. And I'm thinking, this idiot's going to get his head blown off. He needs to get down. And he says, I start screaming at him, get down, get down. Nothing. Get down. Nothing. He says, eventually I get so angry at him for not getting down that I stand up to yell at him, get down. And when I do that, he finally hears me. And he turns around to face me, and he takes a German bullet off of his arm. And the son of a bitch directed it right into mine. And the two of them roll their sleeves up, and they put their arms together, and they have a matching bullet wound from the same German bullet on their arm from D-Day. And he's like, we've had to sit on this side of each other for 60 years so we can tell that story right. And he's like, but man, I tell you, when I got to the end, and I just kind of fell into a hole, I promised myself I'm never going to bed with anything left on the list. And I said, what list? And he goes, because I'd forgotten about the assignment that he gave me. And he says, did you do that thing I asked you? And I'm like, oh yeah. And I reach for this piece of paper, and he goes, you don't have to take it out. That's personal. But I want you to take a look at that list of things you said you'd do if you knew you were going to die at the end of the day tomorrow. And I want you to honestly tell me, is there anything on that list that you were physically incapable of doing? And I looked down the list and I was like, no. He says, is there anything on that list you're actually planning on doing? And I had to look at it really hard, and I had to be honest. I'm like, no. He said, see, that's the difference between you and I. I never go to bed at night with anything left on the list if I can help it. And I've never forgotten my interaction with those two guys. And that assignment that he gave me, and the way he kind of called me out on it, makes me just sort of move on to the last tip that I want to give, and that's to heal. And we don't talk about healing when we talk about leadership all that often, because I think that healing has become associated with weakness the same way that leadership has been incorrectly associated with strength. We put all this focus on strength and not nearly enough on resilience, because ultimately, I think what happens is the greatest leaders I know are not the ones who are the strongest. They're not the ones that never break. They're the ones who become incredibly good at healing and incredibly good at bouncing back from getting broken. And I think that too often when we get broken, we start to assume that it's because somehow we have done something wrong or we don't deserve to see ourselves as strong. And that's not even necessarily the case. And one of the number one ways that we can heal, one of the essential ways that is always available to us that would instantly make our life better, and we choose not to do it, is forgiveness. Because 3 out of the 5 things on that list that I wrote started with the word forgive. Forgiveness is the thing that can instantly make our lives better. and we are completely in charge of it. And just so you know, forgiveness does not mean that you have to bring someone back into your life, but it does mean that you don't carry them around with you as much anymore. Because I think everybody watching this has someone in your life that you wish you could call, you wish you could text, you wish you could share parts of your life with. And the only reason you can't is you have not said I'm sorry, or you have not heard I'm sorry. And sometimes that second one is harder than the first. Fix that. I'm 43 years old and I have been to the funerals of 20 of the people that I love, including that extraordinarily beautiful woman I put up on the screen before. And that means that I have lost too many people in ways that I cannot control to not tell every audience to whom I speak. If you can save a relationship that made your life better, whether it's romantic, whether it's family, whether it's friendship, if you can save a relationship that made your life better by saying I'm sorry or hearing I'm sorry, do it. It is an extraordinary act of self-respect, is an extraordinary act of strength, because there is no worse feeling than going to the funeral of someone you desperately cared about and the last thing you said to them was terrible. And that has happened to me twice. Honestly, leadership, self-respect, strength means making sure you can go to bed every night knowing that that cannot happen. 5 tips from 5 very different types of leaders. Well, 6, I guess, if Jimmy and Earl had 2. Recognize that happiness has to be cultivated. On the good days, plant something for the bad. Plan for failure. All right? You are going to screw stuff up. And ultimately, I think that instead of trying to be like, I'll be strong enough to deal with it when it comes, we're far better off when we point out and we say, here's where it's going to happen. Stop wearing your fake leg. Things in your life that slow you down and hurt you have no place there, and you have every right to get rid of them. Recognize that greatest is the enemy of great, and that when we always compare the best things in our lives to the very best, we diminish most of the good things in our lives. And healing. 5 fundamental tips. And I think that part of the reason that I talk so much and I want so much to talk about self-respect is because hard times are so much harder when we hate ourselves. And ultimately, I don't know how to solve all the problems that anybody might be facing. I don't know how to fix the pandemic, and I know how hard it is to get through all of it. But I know that far too often, most of us start to assume that the bad things that happen to us, we deserve them. You don't deserve the bad things that happen to you. Sometimes you're responsible for them, but you don't deserve them. Because what happens is how you feel about yourself impacts how you treat other people. But also what it does is it impacts how you behave when no one is watching. How you respect yourself impacts how you behave when nobody else is watching. And I think that a lot of us are going through our lives doing things because we're trying to fill some hole in our life, some romantic hole, some educational hole, some career or financial hole. We have this hole in our lives and we're going out there and we're trying to fill it. Well, I discovered, honestly, my life changed when I realized that there is no hole in our lives that cannot be filled with self-respect. And how you behave when nobody is watching is impacted by what you think of yourself. And I just want to tell a final story that really opened my eyes to that. When I was 19 years old, I was crazy in love with this girl. I was like head over heels. She is my sun, my moon, my stars. I cannot live without her. I think her name was Megan. But in order to try to impress Megan and stick around for a summer at my old university, I took on the challenge of running a charity campaign. And I knew nothing about how to run a charity campaign. It was also the worst one of them in the entire country. 60 colleges and universities did this charity, and we were the worst at my university. We made $250 for the whole campaign. The number 1 school in the country made $140,000. And so we took it over and I worked with these amazing people and we ended up breaking all the previous records. We made $15,000. Then we did it again the next year and we set our goal for $20,000. And we put together the greatest fundraising plan in the history of fundraising plans. And I can say that with great confidence because none of you can prove me wrong because we never got to execute it. Because on the day we were supposed to send hundreds of volunteers out into the community of Moncton and Amherst and Sackville, New Brunswick, to shine shoes and wash cars, a hurricane hit the East Coast. And it was still a hurricane when it hit the East Coast. And somehow all these volunteers still went out in this sideways rain and they somehow made $18,000. And I was incredibly proud of what they had done for like 2 days. because 2 days later, a local newspaper, ran a headline that said, campaign comes up $2,000 short. $18,000 2 years after making 200 in a hurricane, and the headline was on what we hadn't done. But what I allowed to happen was I allowed them to convince me that I had screwed up. Because leaders set goals, leaders reach goals. They don't make excuses when they come up short. And I started beating myself up, and this thing that should have been an amazing experience, an amazing thing to celebrate, just became this weight around my neck. And then a couple of days after that, I was closing up the bar. I worked at the campus bar, and I was working with my co-chair on the campaign. There was only the two of us. And at 2:30 in the morning, as we're just finally about to close the door, this young woman comes to the door. And she comes up to the bar, and she says, "Hey, I'm a geek." And I don't know the social etiquette that's supposed to follow someone announcing I'm a geek. So I went with the international symbol of I don't know where this is going. Okay. And she said, "Look, I have to go to med school. It's the only thing I've ever wanted. I have to go to med school. And so I study every single night. I never come out, except I love to dance. I just love to dance. And so what I do is I allow myself the first week of every semester, I come out to the bar and I will dance right until you throw everybody out of the bar. And that's all I do for the whole semester, that first week. And for the last 2 years, I've left this place for the whole first week of school every night, and I walk through the student union building. And when I walk by the student union office, I look in and I see you and your team painting signs and putting together donation boxes. I watched you give 12 speeches in 2 nights to try to convince people to do this campaign. And I wanted to let you know, I've never seen a group of people care more about anything in my life. And I wanted to let you know that I noticed. And I don't think I'm the only one. And I just wanted to say, I feel better there are people like you in the world. And then she handed me an envelope and just walks out. And by the way, if you want someone to cruise for like 25 years on a compliment, may I highly recommend I feel better there are people like you in the world. And so I went over to Amanda, who is my co-chair, and I'm opening up this envelope. I want to tell her what this girl just said. But before I can get there, I get the envelope open. And I expected a note or something. But inside this envelope was a personal check from a 21-year-old university student for $2,000. The money we were missing. And in the memo line, she had written, "For inspiration rendered." And I had never seen her before in my life. And 2 things ripped through my mind. Oh my God, somebody was watching. And then, oh my God, somebody was watching. Because in the pursuit of that goal, because I didn't respect myself enough to think that who I was enough. It had to be about the grades that I got and the money that I raised and the things that I accomplished. In pursuit of that, I had behaved in ways when I thought no one was looking that I would have been incredibly ashamed of. And I started to realize that, look, it's not the goals that you set. It's not even the goals that you reach in your life that define who you are as a person. It's how you behave in pursuit of those goals. And I think that how we behave in pursuit of those goals is in so many ways impacted by how we feel about ourselves. There is no hole in our lives that cannot be filled with self-respect. And honestly, if I can tell you one thing as we go through Wellness Week, and it sounds so cheesy, but someone told me to do it and I keep doing it now, just have the courage to look in the mirror every day and tell yourself one silly little mantra: I deserve good things. Because I make so many of my friends try to look me in the eye and say, I deserve good things. And they always agree. Oh, I know. I said, I didn't ask you to agree with the statement. I asked you to say it to me. And so many of them will break into tears before they can look another person in the eye and say, I deserve good things. You do deserve good things. And ultimately, you don't deserve the bad things that have happened to you. You do deserve good things. You know every bad thing that you've done, and you think that you're the only one that ever did it. There is no hole in our lives that cannot be filled with self-respect. You deserve good things. If you struggle to create them for yourself, you have every right to ask for help. Because somewhere along the way, we were convinced that in order to impress people, we have to find a way to make them look at us and say, oh my God, I didn't know that, or oh my God, I can't do that. The number one thing we can do for ourselves and for each other is to find a way to help people say, oh my God, I thought I was the only one. I thought I was the only one who needed that. I thought I was the only one hurt by that. I thought I was the only one hiding that. You have every right to keep making changes in your life until it's the life you want and the life you deserve. And most importantly, you deserve good things. My friends, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of Wellness Week. Make sure you check out Connect for the full schedule. If you do need support, if you want to reach out, if you want to feel more like you're not the only one, please check in with your student services provider or advisor or your counselor on your campus. You deserve good things. And you know what? Go and claim them. You have every right to do it. Thank you so much for paying attention today. And I wish you only the best. And I wish you so much more than luck. Take care and be safe.